With that in mind and fully in place, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Peter Hayes, who earned his doctorate in political science at the University of Illinois, after which he worked for 30 years as an academic, lecturing in politics and history, mostly spent right here at the University of Sunderland. He's published widely on issues in British and American politics, particularly international adoption policy, as well as on political theory, particularly the writings of Hobbes, Locke, and Marx. On top of which, he's published works on the philosophy of science, on special relativity, and as I was reminded just yesterday, looking over my bookshelf, a thoroughly entertaining and fascinating book on the philosophy of dieting, which is certainly worth a read if you can get a hold of a copy. Since being made redundant as a result of the university's decision in 2020 to close the Politics and History department, he has dedicated himself to a long-standing passion for art, taking a master's degree in fine art and exhibiting his works regularly across the region. We are very glad that he has agreed to come here to talk to us this afternoon about a very significant, and as it is once again in the headlines, extremely topical issue, the circumstances surrounding the conviction and imprisonment of Lucy Letby. Over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for your introduction, Matt. I'll get straight into the presentation. Welcome, everybody. So, obviously, there's a range of views on Lucy Letby. We'll all, I'm sure, be aware of the basic situation in which we find ourselves at the moment. And I'm looking forward in the discussion to listening to any number of different perspectives. So I very much look forward to people's views, whatever they may be. However, my own view on the matter is that Lucy Letby is innocent, and that taken together, the analyses of many experts show not merely that her conviction is unsafe, but that she's not guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. So from this starting point, the questions that I'm going to address are: how could an innocent woman have been convicted of such terrible crimes against babies, and why is she still in prison? And my answer is that Miss Letby has been the victim of a witch hunt, or rather, she's been the victim of two successive forms of witch hunt. The first has been what I call a pseudo-rational witch hunt. This got her convicted by reviving ideas and practices that were worked out about 400 years ago. This was a time when doctors and quasi-lawyers were jostling with clerics to mark out the identification of witches as their field of expertise. The second form of witch hunt has been what I call a judicial-media witch hunt, and that's justified Ms. Letby's continuing incarceration by a combination of propaganda and censorship and a show trial inquiry that's created, or tried to create, the appearance of consensus over her guilt. So I shall move on. So the pseudo-rational witch hunt. In a scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which I expect most of you have probably seen, a crowd accuses a woman of being a witch and takes her to an authority figure, and he engages her in a Socratic dialogue, and then he concocts a ridiculous test of this accusation. Well, for all of the comic absurdity of that scene, it's actually a helpful starting point, I think, for understanding the tragic absurdity of witch hunting. For witch hunting, as this scene suggests, is actually something more than just the irrational and violent passions of a mob. Witch hunting is being conducted through so-called rational investigations. And as we'll see, many of these supposedly rational elements of the witch hunt were being developed in the 16th and the 17th century. So we go back to that time and see what's happening. And if you're suspected as a witch, the first thing the witch hunters do is they try and get you to confess, because that makes conviction easy. So they try and get you to confess, and a lot of so-called witches do confess. But of course there are others who don't. It's by no means invariable that they can extract a confession. If we just jump forward to Miss Letby's case, Miss Letby did not in fact confess, even though the prosecution claimed that she did. And so then she sort of falls into the kind of the pattern that we see for witches who, so-called witches who don't confess, who are then fitted to a pattern of circumstantial evidence. So that there's then circumstantial evidence created to convict witches who do not confess. And this evidence was often critical to proving the witch hunter's case, as it is naturally problematic to provide direct evidence of something that's wholly imaginary. So no honest witness, for example, could ever say to the court, I saw the witch flying. You couldn't do that. Similarly, the case of Miss Letby, in my view, is wholly imaginary, and unsurprisingly, then there is no direct evidence to support it. No one saw her harm a baby. So she has to be fitted up against this circumstantial evidence. And it's quite a flexible affair, fitting circumstantial evidence to a witch. The main purpose of doing it is to secure the conviction. But I've got a non-exhaustive list of the types of evidence that we used. And there it is. And we'll make our way through this list so you can see this list. We've got the proximity of the suspect to the victim at the time they suffered harm, and conversely the recovery of the victim when removed from the suspect. We've got the sudden and unexpected illness or death of the victim. We have the identification of mundane mediums which are used as a means of attacking victims. We've got remedies that are effectual for natural illnesses being ineffectual. We've got the drawing of fine distinctions between apparently similar things in a way that allows witches and their craft to be separated from the innocent. We've got obtaining the second opinion of someone who's already known to be of the same mind. We've got the exclusion of natural causes. We've got the bad character of the suspect. And we've got the suspect's inability or unwillingness to shed tears at the right time. So I say all these things were being worked out in the 16th and 17th century, in that constellation of circumstantial evidence, something along these lines. I say we sort of vary them a little bit, add on one or two extra ones. It was used to convict hundreds of witches of supernatural activities. Well, these supposedly rational investigations were by no means universally accepted, and several truly rational critics took witch-mongering to task. This was done most notably by Reginald Scott, who comprehensively demolished the whole business in his book, The Discovery of Witchcraft, which was published in 1584. Scott and other critics explained how what was going on with the witch hunters is that sometimes witch hunting would be positively malicious, but even where it wasn't, it was founded on a mode of investigation that led inevitably to the most terrible mistakes. Because far from engaging in an objective effort to discover the truth, what the witch hunters were doing is they were fitting their evidence together to confirm their suspicions by ignoring any facts that unequivocally counted against the accusations, and then twisting all the other facts to ensure that they supported this preordained conclusion of guilt. And then what they did, the more facts that they could be filtered, interpreted in this way, the more that witchcraft, so-called, was proved. The witchmongers were perfectly well aware of the rational and humane views which were exemplified by Scott, and they fought back through a mixture of censorship, so James I had Scott's book burnt, sophistry, retrenchment, and ad hominem accusations. However, this criticism continued and finally prevailed when the practice of witch hunting was discontinued and banned in the 18th century. Well, then get to 2022 and 2023, and the pattern of circumstantial evidence which had been developed by the witch hunters about 400 years before was revived and used to ensnare another victim. When Miss Letby was tried and convicted of the murder of babies A, C, D, E, I, O, and P, and the attempted murders of babies B, F, and G, twice L, M, and N, over a period of 13 months in 2015 and 2016. So I turn now to the first of these forms of circumstantial evidence which was used to convict witches and which was also used against Miss Letby, and that's proximity. So the proximity of a suspected witch to, say, a child who became ill or died was frequently used as circumstantial evidence against her by witch hunters. We'll follow through this example. There was a 16th century, this is a fair term, experiment. There was a 16th century experiment to prove that a healer called Alice Samuel of Warboys Village in Cambridgeshire, to prove that she was a witch, causing fits in children. And so the way this experiment worked was that her supposed victims were removed from the manor house where she'd been called and taken to the adjacent churchyard. And when they were taken into the churchyard, they recovered. And then the children were returned to the manor house and to the proximity of Mrs. Samuel, and then their fits recommenced. So you can see, a kind of proximity experiment. In Lucy Letby's trial, the most striking piece of proximity evidence, which has now been discredited, was the roster chart that purportedly showed that when the babies collapsed unexpectedly, Miss Letby was always there. However, proximity was also used by the Chief Prosecutor, Nicholas Johnson, KC, in a manner that followed the experiment that had helped to convict Mrs. Samuel. If a baby was unwell at the Countess of Chester Hospital, where Miss Letby worked, they'd sometimes be transferred to Arrow Park Hospital in Liverpool. And there the babies recovered quickly. For example, baby I, where's Warboys Churchyard? Baby I was transferred to Arrow Park Hospital. She had a episode of bradycardia and desaturations, after which she quickly stabilised. The prosecution say once again a child had recovered quickly out of the care of Letby. That's just taken from the Chester Standard that closely reported the trial on a daily basis. Similar arguments were made for babies H, N and Q, but the cause doesn't lie with Ms. Letby. Arrow Park is a level 3 hospital, one that provides the highest level of care, and at that time Countess of Chester was level 2 in its intensive care unit. So insofar as the shifts to Arrow Park explained the recovery of the babies, the explanation lies in the greater expertise and experience of that hospital. Well, the proximity experiment conducted to show that Mrs. Samuel was a witch was confirmed when she and her husband and her daughter were hanged, because the affected children then stopped suffering from fits altogether and henceforth remained in perfect health. If you can read the rather old script, you'll be able to see that for yourself. And this reported outcome in the case of the 3 Samuel witches is also reflected in Miss Letby's trial. After Miss Letby was removed from the unit, it said the baby stopped collapsing. So Dr. Brewery said there were no more events after Letby left the neonatal unit. He said it was the same staff during the same job, and there were no sudden collapses. It wasn't the same job because on the 7th of July 2016, the unit had been reduced from a level 2 intensive care unit to a level 1 special care unit. The cots had been reduced from 16 to 12, and the gestational age at which they took babies raised from 27 to 32 weeks. Well, we'll move on to the second form of circumstantial evidence which was used against witches and used against Miss Letby, and this was sudden and unexpected illness or death. And this is very, very common in the 17th century. So just as a storm appearing on a sudden was a sign that it had been fomented by a witch, so when a child died suddenly, witchcraft was blamed. But, of course, people do die unexpectedly. George Gifford, who was a somewhat equivocal commentator on witchcraft, expressed it in a case where a witch had supposedly taken the form of a cat. So, oh yeah, and so you can see there's a kind of dialogue going on here in his in his book. He's saying, because the hog and the cow died, are you sure the cat did kill them? Might they not die of some natural causes? As you see, both men and beasts are well and die suddenly. Well, of course, mortality rates have hugely improved since the 17th century, but babies, unfortunately, still do sometimes collapse and die unexpectedly. There's an article in Pediatrics puts it, unwell neonates may initially demonstrate subtle clinical signs, but they rapidly decompensate if left unrecognised and untreated. Well, when babies died at the Countess of Chester Hospital, the doctors may have been caught by surprise at the signs of illness they'd missed. Now, that may have been at least partly due to the fact that the ICU there had insufficient senior cover with only 2 scheduled consultant ward rounds per week. These are quotes from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health from their 2016 report. However, although these things may have been a surprise to the doctors, pathologists identified natural or accidental causes for 5 of the 7 deaths Miss Letby was later accused of causing. The 6th one, the cause was unascertained. The 7th one, they thought there was no need to go to autopsy. The doctors, however, continued to maintain that the deaths were sudden and unexpected, and their suspicion then against Miss Letby on the grounds of proximity was so intense that these explained deaths were de-explained. So they had explanations for most of the deaths, and they said, no, these are unexpected, these are unexplained. Let me move forward to mundane mediums. The fantastical imaginings of the witch hunters were very often grounded in the identification of an everyday, mundane, ordinary, quotidian kind of thing. And that was the medium or evidence of supernatural activities. And this thing is naturally very easy to find in some kind of incriminating locale. So, for example, witches would be held under close observation. They'd be imprisoned in some way, in some kind of cell. And any flies, very mundane, who came into the cell and which the observers of the witches were unable to swat, they'd try and swat them. If they couldn't swat them, they were imps, which of course is fantastical. They were imps come to suck at her. Air is another mundane medium, of course, and witches used air as wind to raise storms, or sometimes simply to breathe or blow on the victim. Well, in Miss Letby's trial, air and milk were identified as mundane mediums, with air said to be used for most of her supposed attacks. I should mention that air or gas in the body is commonly found after death and is evidenced in X-rays. The advantage for Miss Letby's prosecutors, as for earlier witch hunters, of identifying mundane things as mediums of attack is that evidence of these things can be found more or less anywhere. It's easy to find a fly, or obviously it's easy to find a bit of air somewhere. And so you get these things which are very easy to find for perfectly innocent reasons, but they are going to be there. And so it's going to be very difficult for an allegation that they've been used to inflict harm to be definitely shown to be false. Let me keep on moving. I shall go on to ineffectual remedies. Let me quote someone called Dr. John Cotter from 1616. He said, "When natural remedies do extraordinarily or miraculously lose their manifest inevitable nature, use and operation, well, this is an infallible sign either of God or of some diabolical witchcraft at work." Well, the prosecution in Miss Letby's case argued that the ineffectiveness of the remedies applied to the babies that Miss Letby was accused of killing or sometimes of harming was a sign of them having been injected with air to cause an air embolism. This argument was supported when she made her plea to appeal. The prosecution's argument was supported by the judges who refused this. They said that a recurring feature of the circumstantial evidence against her was, here we go, the failure of techniques of resuscitation which could be expected to be successful if the cause was something than air embolus. However, Ms. Letby was also accused of attempted murder via air embolism when resuscitation was successful, including for babies B and M and on 2 occasions baby D. The prosecution here simply asserted that when the babies did recover, that this was suspicious too. For example, after almost half an hour of efforts at resuscitation, child M suddenly recovered as his heart rate rose and he started breathing again. Dr. Ravi Jayaram said, "I was very pleased, but I couldn't really explain what had caused it and why it suddenly got better." This comes from the Chester Standard report of the trial again. This was one of several instances, whether air embolism was alleged or not, when the prosecution used the circumstantial evidence not that resuscitation had failed, but rather that it had worked suspiciously quickly. In addition to babies B, D, and M, this was said for babies H, O, and P. Similar arguments were made about recovery. Here's an example for baby J. Mr. Johnson went on, if infection had been the cause of her rapid decline, would she have recovered as quickly as she did? Dr. Dowie Evans, who was the chief expert witness for the prosecution, replied, I don't think she would. Babies who develop an infection usually recover over a period of days. Well, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, aren't you? When resuscitation failed and the baby died, it was a sign that the baby had been attacked. And when resuscitation succeeded, or the baby recovered, it was a sign that the baby had been attacked. Let me go on to fine distinctions. And I'm taking witch marks as an example here. So opponents of witch hunting pointed out that the so-called witch marks, which were discovered on the bodies of suspects, were in fact natural marks, such as hemorrhoids or tumours. Witch hunters defended their diagnoses. They said that, well, witch marks might appear to be broadly similar to natural marks, but it was possible for an expert to draw fine distinctions to separate out those marks which are the sign of a witch from those which had a natural cause. Ms. Letby's accusers also made fine distinctions. Whenever the defence pointed to some instance of the baby becoming unwell, when Ms. Letby wasn't present, some fine distinction or other would be used to separate this case out from times when she was. This included babies C and P, where there was evidence of air in their bodies prior to Ms. Letby being involved. It included baby I, where an incident had been initially classified as suspicious, and then when it was discovered that Ms. Letby hadn't been there, it was reclassified as unsuspicious. Fine distinctions were also used in the case of baby G, Ms. Letby was accused of deliberately overfeeding with milk, and baby G projectile vomited twice while Ms. Letby was on shift. Baby G also vomited on many other occasions when Ms. Letby wasn't on shift, and this was explained by the prosecution expert witness, Dr. Sandy Bowen, as follows. The difference with these vomits is that they are not projectile vomiting and did not cause child G to be medically compromised. So this fine distinction that's been made between projectile vomiting and other forms of vomiting is then used inconsistently, because there is a further case of projectile vomiting recorded in the medical records when Ms. Letby is not on shift. And by the account of baby G's father, there are in fact several further occasions like this. So if projectile vomiting was treated objectively, rather than being fitted to Ms. Letby's predetermined guilt, the exact same suspicions should have been attached to those caring for the babies on all such occasions. And of course they weren't. We'll go on to second opinions. This is another way of creating this aura of guilt around somebody. And I wanted to go back to look at a further parallel between what's happened to Miss Letby and what happened to Mrs. Samuel, the healer of war boys. So the suspicion against Mrs. Samuel began after one of the daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Throckmorton at the Manor House started to have fits. And the parents then sent a sample of her urine to a distinguished Cambridge doctor. He diagnosed worms and prescribed a medicine. And that cure didn't work. The second cure didn't work either. At this point, someone called Pastor Dodor interpreted this failure as evidence of witchcraft. Which this is actually an example of an ineffectual remedy sort of analysis, isn't it? If a remedy hasn't worked, it must be witchcraft. But what Pastor Dodor did is he went on to suggest that the Throckmortons obtain a second opinion, which was given by Pastor Butler. And Pastor Butler said that the urine provided no evidence of worms and there was no point in trying the cures because they had already been tried and hadn't worked. And what the Throckmortons should do is they should stop wasting their money on medicine and start looking for witchcraft as the explanation instead. And that second opinion from Pastor Butler was a foregone conclusion. Pastor Dodor knew that Pastor Butler, was of the same mind, was going to say the same kind of thing. In Lucy Letby's trial, the defence argued that Dr. Bowen, who had reviewed and concurred with the conclusions of Dr. Evans, the defence said that Dr. Bowen wasn't providing a kind of an objective second opinion, but basically stood in the same relationship to Dr. Evans as Pastor Butler had stood to Pastor Dodor. That charge was rejected by Dr. Bowen at the trial, and it was also rejected by the Court of Appeal. However, there are at least possible indications that those tasked to give a second opinion in Lucy Letby's case may have been pre-selected to support the prosecution case against her. And to explain this, I want to just briefly go back into a kind of a second, much more recent period of history, because, of course, witchcraft trials aren't the only background to the disastrous mistakes which I think have been made in Miss Letby's case. There's a complex, recent medical history which also needs to be taken into account. So we go right back to the late 1970s. We see British paediatricians starting to investigate Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And there then follows a contentious series of legal and medical developments that include the convictions of Mrs. Sally Clark and Mrs. Angela Cannings for murdering their own children. And those convictions were then quashed in 2003. The mistakes that were made in convicting Mrs. Clark and Mrs. Cannings have a degree of overlap with the mistakes made in Miss Letby's case. And two of the people involved in making those mistakes were Dr. Martin Ward-Platt and Sir Robin Spencer. Dr. Evans, the main prosecution expert, he chose Dr. Ward-Platt to provide a second opinion on his findings on Miss Letby, although Dr. Ward-Platt unfortunately died before the trial. And after Miss Letby had been convicted, the first person to hear her plea to appeal was Sir Robin Spencer. I don't know whether either of these choices of second opinion were made with this background in mind. I don't know. However, I think there is a much more decisive, albeit an indirect, case of pre-selection with respect to a second opinion. And it's indirect because it occurs when an expert is invited to give an opinion, and that invitation is then withdrawn. So in 2021, the Crown Prosecution Service intervened to veto a police decision to ask Professor Jane Hutton, Warwick, to prepare a statistically valid chart to replace the chart that we're all familiar with, I expect. So there's the chart, or the infamous chart, the chart with the long row of X's against Miss Letby's name. This is the chart that Mr. Johnson would tell the jury made it, quote, self-evidently obvious that Miss Letby was guilty. So Professor Hutton had first been asked to calculate the probability of what the chart showed. They said, can you tell us what this chart shows? What is the probability of this happening by chance? Is it, and this is, again, it's a direct quote, is it 1 in a million or something like that? So they asked, what's the probability? Is it 1 in a million? And she responds by explaining the measures that are needed to construct a statistically valid chart. So she says, well, you can't do this. So she explains about all of the numerous flaws in the chart and what they need to do. And the police then ask Professor Hutton to construct such a chart, but they're overruled by the prosecutors. In other words, having been initially invited to provide a second opinion that fitted the case against Miss Letby, Professor Hutton was disinvited from testing this case. Let me move on to exclusion. Witch hunters very often would diagnose, there must be something supernatural going on, because they would exclude natural causes of illness or death. And this allows anything that cannot be explained to be attributed to the actions of a witch. Now, given the indeterminate number of natural causes of illness and death, that reasoning is unsound. It fits a suspect to predetermine guilt on the paradoxical grounds that because you don't know what's happened to the suspect, well, then you do know. You know that they must have been the victim of a witch. And that argument, the argument, I do not know what natural processes cause someone's illness or death, therefore I know it was witchcraft. That argument was strongly and repeatedly criticised by opponents of witch hunting. They argued that it was impossible to exclude an indeterminate number of natural causes. So Robert Filmer makes the point by referring to how continual scientific discovery has only indicated the limits of our knowledge. He says, it would pose Aristotle himself to tell us everything that can be done by the power of nature, and what things cannot, for there be daily many things found out, and daily many more, which our forefathers never knew to be possible in nature. Even though he was a supporter of witch hunting, actually Dr. Cotter agreed with that. So Dr. Cotter was on the same side as Filmer here. He described the possible natural causes of disease as infinite and innumerable, and emphasised this point with long lists of illnesses, which made the attribution of any symptom to a supernatural rather than a natural cause deeply problematic. Filmer and Cotter's arguments were reflected in the Court of Appeal judgment in the Canning's case, where the judges repeatedly warned of the limits of our knowledge of infant deaths, and of cases, quote, where natural causes, whether explained or unexplained, cannot be excluded as a reasonable and not a fanciful possibility. When Ms. Letby went to the Court of Appeal and said, please, can I appeal? And they rejected her. But they did, during the course of their written judgment, they actually also said evidence which is, if you say, oh, it must be air embolism because of because we can just exclude everything else. He said that would have been a matter of mere conjecture, but they then said, well, Dr. Bowen and Dr. Evans didn't give such evidence, and they give a very obscure argument, which I can't really understand, to explain why they say that Dr. Evans and Dr. Bowen didn't give this evidence by exclusion. Now, I think very much to his credit, Dr. Evans has been perfectly clear about the air embolism evidence he gave at the trial. In an interview he gave to Dr. Raj Prasad on the 5th of September 2023, so that's less than a month after the trial had ended, Dr. Evans explained that in some cases at least, his identification of air embolism was based entirely upon exclusion, even without X-ray evidence, because he couldn't identify any other cause. And I think if I press this, you'll be able to hear him for yourself.
How do you know the diagnosis is air embolism in those cases, then?
Because these are cases where your diagnosis is made by ruling out other factors, and you end up with the diagnosis where this is the only explanation. You've ruled everything out. What's left is the diagnosis.
Pretty straightforward. As I say, so I've, you know, I think I think we do have to credit Dr. Evans with honesty in that. Anyway, that's what he said. Let's move on to bad character. In accordance with the association between whores and witches, women suspected of supernatural activities were investigated for signs of bad character, or a naughty manner of living, or inordinate vagrant lusts. And Lucy Letby was similarly investigated. And in court, her innocuous life was fitted to the required template of drinking, dancing, gambling and sex. And the press relayed...
How do you know the diagnosis is air
embolism? The press relays the sort of shocking details of all of this. So we could read here, they went through all of her text messages and so on. So 2 hours after the unexpected collapse of child M, Letby messaged a friend, work has been shite, but I've just won £135 on the Grand National. The court heard, but Letby had moved into a new home near the hospital earlier in the week. On a group WhatsApp post to friends just before 2 p.m. on the same shift, he wrote, "Sorry guys, mad busy 4 days in work. You can come to mine if you want to, just need to unpack first. Haven't got a spare bed yet, though, so can't stay, unfortunately. Looking forward to catch up. Got a magnum of Prosecco and vodka, whoop, no disco ball, but sure we can manage." Let me go on to the inability to shed tears. In 2024, ACL Moss reports noticing something strange about a photo of Miss Letby in a physical printed edition of the Chester Standard. At first glance, the photo appears identical to the ubiquitous police mugshot, and yet it is subtly different. In particular, in the newspaper photo, although not in the familiar mugshot, Miss Letby appears to have been crying. To quote ACL Moss, "Lucy's eyes are visibly red underneath, the pool of tears are in each tear duct, and she has a slightly swollen red nose." I'm not going to add to the speculation as to why the two photos appear the same and yet different. It may very well amount to nothing. Nonetheless, inability to weep or weeping at the wrong time has frequently been used by witch hunters as an indication that the suspect is guilty. So we go back to 1647, and see the witchfinder general Matthew Hopkins suggesting that when witches are accused of witchcraft, they don't cry, although actually they do on other occasions. So here he is. He's saying, "Witches, if they be at any time abused by being called a whore or a thief and so on, are the readiest to cry and wring their hands and shed tears in abundance. But when they are accused for this horrible and damnable sin of witchcraft, they never alter or change their countenances, nor let one tear fall." In Lucy Letby's 2023 trial, Nicholas Johnson KC suggested that Miss Letby's lack of tears on some occasions, she in some occasions in talk she wouldn't shed tears, on other occasions she would, and that was a sign of her guilt. And Johnson actually chose to open his cross-examination then with the following question. Ms. Letby, is there any reason why you cry when you talk about yourself, but you don't cry when you talk about all these dead and seriously injured children? Reginald Scott the great 16th century opponent of witch hunts, criticises various preposterous associations between witches and weeping, which are brought up repeatedly at these trials. And he goes through all these different ridiculous ideas, including the trial of true or false tears and the idea that, quote, wicked women cannot weep. And he also, I think, very astutely observes that, again, to quote him, many an honest matron cannot sometimes in the heaviness of her heart shed tears. I think benumbed by the bad treatment they were receiving. Many of these accused women may indeed have been beyond tears. So, before I move forward to the kind of the second form of witch hunt, I wanted to sort of pause and just say a little bit about another aspect of the trial, which kind of links the first and second forms of witch hunt together, and this is lynch mob morality. So witch hunters engaged in the public humiliation of their victims before conviction. That's a very regular part of the witch hunt. And these humiliations sometimes took the form of atrocious assaults, but were usually milder. They're still very outrageous forms of humiliation, such as examining a witch's body or suspect's body for witch marks. Anyway, whatever the ostensible rationale might have been of these assaults, there was also a kind of an underlying purpose, which was to exploit the all too common sort of cart before a horse way of thinking, that if a suspect is being ill-treated, then that in and of itself is evidence of her guilt. And that way of thinking then in turn is associated with the kind of the lynch mob's moral justification for its pleasure, which is she's being treated appallingly, so she must deserve it. Well, in Miss Letby's trial, Nicholas Johnson KC used circumstantial evidence of bad character to simultaneously frame Miss Letby as a whore and a liar and to humiliate her. So Miss Letby had a friendship with a doctor who was a married man. This man was persistently referred to in court by Mr. Johnson as Miss Letby's boyfriend. And when they looked through all her text messages and so on, back in 2016, she'd had some text messages with a fellow nurse who jokingly asked Miss Letby whether this doctor had requested her to go commando, meaning to wear clothes but no knickers. And so Mr. Johnson shows this exchange to the jury, and he asks, what does that mean? Is it a reference to the Royal Marines? I don't know. You don't know? Go commando? You don't understand what that means? Well, you understand it because you found it highly amusing. So what did you understand the message to mean? I don't know. I can't say right now. I don't know. Do justice to yourself. What did you understand go commando to mean? Did you think this was an army reference, you being from Hereford? I don't know. So I don't know what the jury made of this humiliation. There are, however, a number of comments on discussion forums, including Reddit and Tatterlife and YouTube, that praise this line of questioning and suggest that it was important in showing Miss Letby's guilt. And the KC, I think, may have viewed the exchange in the same light, as he brought up Go Commando again, later in his cross-examination, and then he reminded the jury of it again in his summing up. Well, I'll move forward to the judicial-media witch hunt. So as the pseudo-rational witch hunt played out at Miss Letby's trial, a second form of witch hunt started to emerge. And after her convictions were announced, which was on the 18th of August 2023, it quickly took a definite shape. So this new witch hunt, I think, has got these characteristics. It blurs the distinction between upholding the law and telling a story. It reverses the principle that justifies contempt of court, censorship, and it creates the appearance of consensus via non-rational methods of pressure rather than rational agreement. So I'll turn then first to the law and the story. Upholding the law has, or should have, a rational basis in placing a cardinal value on truth. But stories are not bound by this stricture, are they? What makes a satisfying story is not necessarily true. So witches, for example, are mythical, but myths make for a good story. Miss Letby's witch hunters presented her supposed activities in kind of story form. And the first draft of this witch story was told by the prosecution during the trial. The second draft has been largely created by journalists. The journalists believed the first draft, but they've been wanting to improve it by punctuating its dark mysteries with moments of sudden illumination. And in this redrafting, they've had assistance from two of Miss Letby's main accusers amongst the Countess of Chester consultants. Dr. Breary and Dr. Jayaram both understand that a good witch story needs moments of dramatic revelation. So during the trial, Dr. Jayaram described reading Dr. Shuli's article. You should remember the name Shuli. Anyway, he described reading Dr. Shuli's article on air embolism in terms of a sudden shock. I remember sitting on my sofa at home with the iPad and reading that description and the physical chill that went down my spine because it fitted what we were seeing. Immediately after the verdicts, Dr. Breary describes finding a baby's insulin test results while searching for further crimes for the police. He makes no mention, and perhaps has no awareness, of either the complex question of the interpretation of these results or the problem of their reliability. But instead what he does is he depicts his reading of the figure, when he reads these figures, he kind of shows it as a kind of a cinematic moment of sort of awful clarity. So he says, I just had this gut-wrenching moment. What the fuck is this? Said Breary. It was a smoking gun. You saw it there in plain sight. If there was any doubt, iota of doubt, it was removed then. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that Breary and Jayaram have said. The second draft also of the story requires strong, simple contrasts. Strong, simple contrasts as befits the story of a beautiful, evil witch. And here we've got plain-speaking Paul Hughes, who is the detective superintendent and the lead police investigator in the case, and he provided helpful material. So the babies who had been allegedly attacked were, in truth, these little neonates with serious health problems. And in the first draft of the story, as it was told during the trial, that truth was reframed by the prosecution as the babies were doing remarkably well under the circumstances, with their difficulties downplayed. In the second draft, the babies' medical problems were actually being erased altogether. So the detective superintendent put it in this way in a Daily Mail podcast. He said, from a picture of strength and from a picture of health, babies were suddenly collapsing and dropping. Quite a transition. The police and the Crown Prosecution Service, however, haven't been content to play a subsidiary role to the media in creating the story. They think of this story as being their story, and they've taken proactive measures to try and ensure that they are going to be in control. The police and the Crown Prosecution Service in this case seem to think that their job is not just to uphold the law, but also to present the public with a story. And I think this has blurred into the notion that to uphold the law is to tell the story. And let's see what they've done. They've done these things. The first thing they did, we don't know quite what they did, but in October 2022, before the trial started, there was a confidential pre-meeting between the Crown Prosecution Service and the police and representatives of the media. The defence wasn't invited. 4 days after the verdicts were announced, there was an hour-long documentary, which is obviously a considerable time in the making, released by Cheshire Constabulary. And also, in August of 2023, just after the verdicts, the police and the Crown Prosecution Service apparently put out a tender for a media company to collaborate with them in presenting their story. According to the Times, the paper of record, ITN is understood to have beaten more than 6 other companies, thought to include the BBC, in a competitive process that Cheshire Force ran with the CPS. The unusual decision to run a tender was driven by the ambition for the authorities to collaborate with a company that they could trust with the right level of expertise to handle a case of such complexity, sensitivity, and profile. I think the latter part of that story, at least, sounds rather like a blurb which must have been supplied by the police and the CPS or something. Okay, so we've got the blurring of the law and the story. We've got also the reversal of the principle underlying contempt of court. Censorship of discussion of impending trials conflicts with the right to free speech. In this conflict of law, the Law Commission has argued the only legitimate reason for upholding censorship is to ensure the right of the defendant to a fair trial before an impartial jury. In Ms. Letby's case, contempt of court has been used for exactly the opposite purpose. It's been used to ensure an unfair trial. So, in September 2023, it was announced that Ms. Letby was going to be retried on one charge, the attempted murder of baby K, and censorship was imposed. This censorship silenced experts, and at least in the UK, it silenced journalists who doubted the safety of the convictions for over 9 months. It wasn't until the 2nd of July 2024, when Ms. Letby was convicted for this attempted murder, that they were free to start to speak out. In the interim, it was left to a small, rather heterogeneous group of people concerned about the verdict, mainly members of the public of no particular status, to try and fill the void. Unaware of all this censorship that was in place, one can understand why other members of the public, all potential jurors, might concur with Lady Justice Furwell's comment made 2 weeks before the start of the retrial in June 2024, that those who maintained that Ms. Letby had been wrongly accused were conspiracy theorists. This censorship was one-sided. Critics of the verdict were silenced, but its supporters were not. It was permissible, in fact it was de rigueur, for the media to constantly preface Ms. Letby's name with a damning prefix, such as the evil nurse Lucy Letby or child serial killer Lucy Letby. It was permissible to extol the main prosecution witness against her in the forthcoming retrial, that's Dr. Jayaram, as a hero. That was perfectly fine. So a week before the retrial, Rod McPhee in The Sun described the development of an all-star drama that would tell the beautiful evil witch story. Jed Mercurio was to be in charge, and either Sophie Turner or Jodie Comer would play Miss Letby. And Dr. Jayaram himself was helping to make the drama, which would try to explain why her crimes could have gone on for so long and how others, particularly Dr. Jayaram, tried to act when suspicions were raised. It was also permissible to publish articles that were thinly concealed sadistic celebrations of Miss Letby's fate. And these stories included one by Mia Dalton in the Mirror, under the following headline, Lucy Letby's disturbing life in prison, funeral punishment, sex favours and insanity. Such stories then appeal to the same Lynch mob morality exploited by the witch hunters. Let me move on to creating complicity. So the Furwell inquiry, which is at Liverpool Town Hall, is premised on the assumption of Miss Letby's guilt. It's presented as an exercise in rational truth-seeking, but it is not rational to ignore expert opinions that contradict your own. The inquiry's real purpose is not to uncover the truth, but to garner public affirmations of Miss Letby's guilt from witnesses. And it's been almost wholly successful in doing this. One witness was the nurse Yvonne Griffiths, who in 2016 was a deputy ward manager at the Countess of Chester. And at that time, Ms. Griffiths had repeatedly described the gathering witch hunt against Miss Letby as a witch hunt. And that wouldn't do, and so Nicholas de la Peur, KC, asks her at the Furwell inquiry, do you think it's possible that you had lost objectivity by this point to be speaking about the consultants in terms of a witch hunt? Ms. Griffiths prevaricates about that. So Richard Baker, KC, takes on a different tack, asking about a time when Miss Letby had actually gone over Miss Griffiths' head and gone to the ward manager who'd reversed a decision that she'd made. And Richard Baker then, KC, he has this question and answer session. He said, would you, with the benefit of hindsight, regard that as a very manipulative behaviour on the part of Letby? And then Ms. Griffiths begins to answer as follows. I suppose it shows a very overcompetent, confident nurse. And then Ms. Griffiths pauses and starts to muse on the matter before concluding, I don't think that it was appropriate, and I agree. I think it was quite manipulative. Richard Baker Casey then immediately suggests further terms that might be used to describe Miss Letby, and Miss Griffiths agrees to them. So the Casey says, it's quite grandiose and arrogant as well, isn't it? Miss Griffiths, yes, it is. And I find it difficult to decide what to make of such exchanges, because, of course, many witnesses might honestly believe Miss Letby guilty, but it would seem unlikely that all of them do. In some cases, at least, a mixture of intimidation, moral blackmail, manipulation, career impact worries, and establishment expectations of the appropriate role play may have helped to ensure that the witnesses endorse Miss Letby's guilt. The most difficult witnesses to deal with were the hospital managers whose own investigators had cleared Miss Letby back in 2016. They were encouraged to say what was needed by tacit bargaining. After the guilty verdicts, Cheshire Police had announced that they were, quote, in the early stages of a corporate manslaughter probe into the hospital. They weren't yet sure who they were going to prosecute, but they certainly might charge somebody. Later, Lady Thirlwell issued a reminder of this fact. And the tacit bargain then was this. It was, say Letby is guilty and you will not be tried for manslaughter. Say anything else and you will. The BBC reporter Judith Morris, who actually thinks Miss Letby guilty, put the matter this way. She said, when she opened the public inquiry, Lady Thirlwell said the Cheshire Police were investigating whether there may be a case of corporate manslaughter against the hospital trust. Perhaps mindful of it, the executives seemed to choose their words carefully. All had the same legal representation and opened their evidence with an apology to the victims' families, some of whom were in the room. So those publicly denouncing Miss Letby at the inquiry have included representatives of public bodies, expert bodies, regulatory agencies and quangos. And through this, an appearance of official consensus has been achieved. And numerous institutions of state and civil society have been complicit, they've been made complicit in keeping Miss Letby in prison. However, at least one nurse at the Countess of Chester wouldn't play along with the assumption of guilt made at the Thirlwell inquiry. And in her written response to its questions, this nurse stated that Miss Letby was innocent. The nurse was not invited to testify. Well, you might say, she's only a nurse, what does she know? However, in her written response to questions from the inquiry, Nina Modi, who is Professor of Neonatal Medicine at Imperial College and an ex-president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, she expressed doubt about Miss Modi's guilt, and she wasn't invited either. Well, what next? How do we conclude all of this? Lucy Letby was convicted as the outcome of a witch hunt that used methods dating back to the 16th century. She remains in prison because of a new form of witch hunt that draws together powerful elements within the criminal justice system and media. Through propaganda, censorship, and public denunciation, this new form of witch hunt is dedicated to ensuring Miss Letby's endless imprisonment. It's irrational, but it's been quite an effective way of wielding power by controlling the narrative. The witch hunters, however, haven't had things their own way. In May 2024, The New Yorker published an article by Rachel Aviv that comprehensively questioned the guilty verdicts. And when the censorship was lifted in July, mainstream British journalists who'd already been on the case started to make up for lost time. And there were several of these in The Guardian, in The Telegraph, and even on BBC's File on 4. There was also perhaps a kind of a tacit understanding between the defence of Miss Letby and the courts when she appealed against her retrial conviction, because the defence only put forward a very lacklustre kind of appeal bid, but the appeal court, unprompted, said that, quote, legitimate criticism could be made of the tardy and inconsistent evidence of the main prosecution witness, who was Dr. Jairam. Some of the ambitious media plans for the beautiful, evil witch story also seem to have fallen through. This is the, that's the That's the court talking about the inconsistency of Dr. Jairam's evidence. The film stars Jodie Comer and Sophie Turner have both let it be known that they're not going to star in a Jed Mercurio drama after all. And a year after Chester Police and the CPS appeared to have told the Times how they'd awarded this contract to ITN, they've point blank said, no, we haven't. So they've denied it. There's also, of course, been a very well-publicised development with respect to a new raft of experts who've spoken out on Miss Letby's behalf. On February the 4th, Dr. Shu Lee, the same doctor whose air embolus article caused a shiver to run down Dr. Jairam's spine, he presented a summary of the findings of a panel of neonatologists. According to Dr. Lee, all the deaths and collapses attributed to Miss Letby were actually due to natural causes and to medical errors. In no case had a crime been committed. There is then, I think, some reason to hope that rationality may soon be restored and Miss Letby freed, either by rapid referral to the Court of Appeal from the Criminal Cases Review Commission, or by some form of parliamentary or ministerial intervention, or even by a snowball effect, as so many people speak out over Miss Letby's innocence that the witch hunters begin to doubt their own wisdom or otherwise fall into disarray. However, as things stand, power still lies with the witch hunt faction. The government stonewalls, MPs look the other way, and Miss Letby continues to be investigated by the police and may face further charges. If any new charges are combined with the misuse of court orders to impose censorship, this could stifle the efforts to put things right indefinitely. History provides no reason for complacency. Reginald Scott published his great denunciation of witchmongers in 1584, but the hunting of witches for supposed supernatural activities was only banned in England in 1735. It had taken 150 years for Parliament to catch up. Thank you.